Sheriff's Posse grounds in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's quite an honor. And my name is Laura Harper, and I am the filmmaker of Mustang of the Caracas Mesa documentary. And I'd like to have my other guests here introduce themselves.
My name is Dusty Pierce.
And my name is Sarah Enid.
And so we need to bring our microphone right up to our mouths so that the audience can hear what we're saying, so let's not forget that. But anyway, the Caracas Mesa is the setting for the Mustang of the Caracas Mesa and documentary, and it is about 70 miles east of Bluefield, New Mexico. And so if you take Highway 64 and you're headed towards Dulce and Taos, then you will find there the Carson National Forest. And that is where I found my horse, Rambo. And I had it was kind of a mixed emotion, but it was a situation where I did see and wanted to witness the idea of bait and trap, a humane way to gather horses. So I went out there to the Caracas Mesa and witnessed that back in 2012. Dan Elkins at that time was the bait trapper there in the Hickory Ranger District. And so then 2 years later, after seeing this band of horses being trapped, I ended up adopting one of those horses, and his name was Rambo. So it's a long story, and of course you need to see the film in order to understand that process. But once I became the proud owner of Rambo, I wanted to understand who he was and how important he was. And what I did find is that he was a treasure in my own backyard, 70 miles from my own home. And so I set about trying to understand what made him a treasure. And so I sent his DNA into Texas A&M. At the time, Dr. Gus Cothran was the go-to person at that time for DNA testing at Texas A&M. And he came back a Galaseño, which I discovered was a Guarano. And so I would like to now ask Sarah, what is the importance of that?
Okay, get it right up my mouth. So I've been interested in these horses practically since birth because my father was one of the people who helped the Spanish Mustang registry that was organized in the 1950s acquire their founding stock. And one of the strains that I grew up wanting one of, and I didn't manage to get one of until I was 65, was the Hickory Apache horses. And the Hickory Apache, the Apache in general, the anthropologists recognized them as being one of the first indigenous peoples of North America to completely integrate the colonial Spanish light horse mercenary cavalry traditions into their lifestyle. That means that they got horses really early on, probably about between 1500 and 1540. And the first horses that came over, because the Hickory Apache actually got their horses up at the headwaters of the Platte River. And they brought them down into the Four Corners area. And the only way that colonial Spanish horses would have gotten to the headwaters of the Platte River was through the horses that were brought first to the Caribbean islands and then established as garrisons in Georgia, actually, by a guy named Juan Prado. And he was a really interesting guy who made friends with the southeastern Indians, which is almost unheard of. And he established these garrisons that were inland, and the Spanish crown decided that he was a treasonous, seditionist rebel, which the light horse cavalry people tend to get categorized as, and that they did not want to support these garrisons, and so they disappeared from the record. And if you go and look at the indigenous history of that area, during this period of time, almost all of the indigenous peoples of the Mississippi Valley vanished. So being me, I went and read up on the mythology of the North African and Berber, we now call them Berbers, but they're actually tribal peoples, who have their own mythology that they kept alive. And that included, in instructions in their mythology that when you're in really big trouble, what you do is you head north and west and you cross the big water. So if you're in Mississippi, that Mississippi Valley, Georgia, in that area, and you have genocidal Spanish troopers coming after you, and you have a vulnerability to European diseases, you're going to want to get out of there. So they headed north and west across the big water to Missouri and the Mississippi, and met up with the Apache, who are Algonquin speakers, and the Algonquin speakers did come across the Bering Strait, and they split into two streams, and one moved all the way to the east and became like the Abenaki, and one went to the southwest, and they brought the horses that they had met in the 1500s down into northern New Mexico. So when that shows up, and they had both the Gallicino and the Garano in the horse ancestry reports. The Gallicino horses were more Spanish aristocracy. They came in as part of the first wave of colonists. So when you have Gallicino pop up as the first thing, you have a horse that has been on this continent for a really long time and is carrying a huge chunk of the history of how the indigenous people and the colonial Spanish refugees, as well as the colonists, interacted.
That is so interesting to me. And so if we look at Rambo, though, Indiana Garano, he is of the Alpine region of Italy, of Portugal, and Iberia, the northern area of Spain. Going back to that, sometimes when I think about Rambo and his confirmation, is what a lot of us call it, and then we'll go back to his ancient and antiquity. But anyway, can we talk a little bit about his being a square horse, the importance of that to perhaps the conquistadors and the Spanish Jeanette? And I kind of, tend to go by that the Berber, the Arabian, and the Turkoman might have been probably the progeny of the Spanish Jeanette that developed over 800 years. But I'd like to talk a little bit about his build and how that is important to the conquistador and the cavalries, and maybe how that might relate to the New Mexico cavalries.
Okay, so that's a big chunk of information to cram into a short talk. So the square build that she's talking about is something that I got interested in because in the 1980s I had about 30 northern New Mexico heritage horses, and the Albuquerque History Museum called me up, and they said, we actually, some of our surprise, won the bid, and I believe it was the Duke of Albuquerque's attic, where they had found a complete set of Spanish armor. That included armor for the dog, because they had like collars and protective metal sheets for the fighting mastiffs, great big fighting dogs. They had armor for the footman, they had armor for the knight, and they had armor for the horse. And the reason they called me was because they could not find a modern horse that this armor would fit. The proportions were off. And they called me up pretty much as a dare in retrospect, because I was in my early 20s, and I had lots of horses, and I had lots of brothers I was putting through rehab at the same time as the horses. I was doing equine therapy before it was a thing. And they were route riding and at Las Golondrinas and making a splash in the news. And so I went out and I measured all of my horses. And I measured how long their backs were, how long their shoulders were, how deep their girths were, and how long their necks were. And the armor fit. So then I started wondering why. Why is this armor, why are these horses so special? And among the Spanish Mustang registries, there was this great discussion, and it was a source of contention, and it was a way to say, my horse is better than your horse. My horse has a Spanish hip. Well, I have a very literal mind, and I wanted to know what exactly a Spanish hip was. I wasn't going for my horse has a better, I like my horse more than your horse, so my horse has a Spanish hip and yours doesn't. I'm like, that doesn't work. There has to be an objective thing. So I went and I did a whole lot of research into two areas, one of which was equine pathology, how horses get injured. And there's a really wonderful guy named Dr. James Rooney, who's unfortunately dead now, but he started the field of equine biomechanics. And he talked about how horses get injured. He said, you know, it's physics. You can tell what's going to happen by the way the horse is built and the way they move, where the weak points are, where they're going to get hurt. And then I went and looked into the Baroque and the industrial French definitions of a square horse. And it turns out that what they were calling a square horse had to do with the angle at the hip and the shoulder, 90 degrees. And if you have a 90-degree angle at the hip and the shoulder joint, and you draw lines, you end up with a perfect equilateral diamond, and the center is exactly in the middle of the horse's back. And if the rider sits there, they can carry the horse with they can carry the rider with a minimal effort. And a horse that's built this way doesn't waste energy lifting their own weight or the weight of their rider. All of their energy goes into forward motion. That means this is the horse that's going to be not only alive, but mobile after you've done, you know, your 10-day forced march without food and water. This is the horse that's going to survive in the desert where there's nothing to eat and nothing to drink. So these horses, for the light horse cavalry, they were their, I can't even think of the word, their mainstay. They depended on them. And it's a very unique build. It's the build that also produces all of the airs above the ground and the airs of fantasy, which I discovered because my horse began to offer them to me. But then I had to go study dressage. It was a backwards thing. I didn't come to it this way. And part of the reason that New Mexico horses are so incredibly special is we have this remarkably harsh, arid, dry, high desert. It's a really, really difficult environment. And you can turn a whole lot of horses loose here, but not all of them are going to live. And I'll turn it over to Dusty in a minute, and he can talk about his surprise at the genetics of the northern New Mexico horses. Because these horses are the war horses. They're the horses that can carry people and their weapons, get to the battle, fight, and have the energy to get you home again. So on that note, I'll hand it over to Dusty.
But before that, I just want to say it was so exciting then when I got the news that I had a Garano and a Galaseño, and then contacted Sarah Annan to find out exactly how far his ears were apart, how far his eyes were apart, so that he would meet those criteria for the Conquistador armor, and that his measurements were exactly, his width and his height were precisely the same, 14.1 hands on both sides. So with that, I also understand that Rambo is a horse, of course, and so with that, I'll turn this over to Dusty to tell us about that and the history of horses way back into antiquity.
Thank you. If you think about what it would have been like to cross the ocean in the hull of a wooden ship in the late 1400s and early 1500s, that had to be an absolutely terrifying thing for these horses. The horses were suspended in a rack so that their feet would barely touch the ground. And they were held that way in bad weather. And if that bad weather lasted for a week, the horses never had their feet on the ground for a week. This would have been a very terrible thing, and they actually had a very high mortality rate. So this makes the horses that made it over here extra special because they either were lucky with the weather or they're very, very tough to survive these transatlantic trips. So traditionally, when we look at the DNA on these horses, we were expecting to see everything going right back to, the Iberian Peninsula, where the Spanish were bringing these horses from. What has been very, very interesting is now we have studies that are showing that they were finding these horses here before the Spanish started bringing horses across the ocean. So how they got here is one of the things that we need to do a lot of research on. But it's really causing everybody to rethink what they thought they knew. We have found horse bones down in South America, in Mexico, up in the Yukon. And all of these horse bones are falling into a time period after the horse is supposed to have gone extinct in the last ice age around 12,000 years ago. And we keep finding these horse bones that are 6,000 years old, 5,000 years old, 3,500 years old, right up into historic times. And in some of these sites, we have these horses that come from maybe the year 1400 or the year 1000, very close to the Spanish introduction in the 1500s. When the Spanish introduced the horses here, they were slowly moving north. And they got up into the Four Corners region here, and it's traditionally taught that they made it out into the wilds in 1680 with the Pueblo Revolt, when the Pueblo Indians released at least 1,000, 1,200 head of these Spanish horses out into the wild. Of course, the Indians like the Utes and the Apaches and the Shoshones were right there to snatch them up. So this was supposed to be some of the early introduction of these horses. But again, when you start following the DNA, we keep finding that these Indians had horses way before this. And that's what's turning everything upside down. And we are very excited to start taking a look at the genetics, because with DNA, we can follow some of these markers back. And we don't see the connection to the extinct horses from 12,000 years ago. We're not seeing a direct lineage coming down through there. What we are seeing is a lineage that is consistent with what's going on in Europe and Asia. So the belief is that these horses were getting into North America, possibly across the land bridge, and moving down into across the United States and Mexico and into South America. Another possibility is transoceanic visitation to America, where these horses came across in boats with people that were traveling to America before the Spanish. And we know that the Vikings were in North America 500 years before Columbus. And we know that the Chinese were here on the West Coast and probably created what we call the Olmec race that led to the Aztecs and the Mayans. And all of these things are proven through human genetics now. And this has been a big surprise to people. The White Shell Clan of the Navajos are high 90% Chinese DNA. So we're seeing that the people that came here didn't just come across the land bridge, that they came here by boats also. So we know that the Chinese traveled with horses. And now we're seeing that the genetics on the Appaloosa horses is going back to the Chinese origin of the Appaloosa. So when Magellan came around the Horn and traveled up the west coast of South America and North America, and he got up into the Oregon area, he would see horses and Indians riding those horses, and he saw large herds of horses. And this would have been in 1580, and no real way for the Spanish horse to have gotten up there. So we also are finding genetically some interesting things that we're seeing English bloodline horses in America way before the English brought horses over here. So this is a new field that's opening up. It's very exciting, and it's showing that a lot of the things that we thought we knew was incorrect. And for me, that's very, very exciting. So one of the things that's very interesting is among these horses that were here first are these horses that are linked to Rambo. So that's kind of a fun question. When did they get across? How did they get across? And those are questions that we want to look into. We do know that the Phoenicians came across the ocean and were in North America at the time they were building the pyramids. And what I haven't talked about is what brought the Phoenicians here. And the largest deposit of native copper in the entire world, okay, is found in Lake Michigan. So they were mining copper in North America and taking it back to the pyramids. And the pyramids, the stone masonry was being done largely with copper tools. So an interesting thing that if you have a copper deposit any place in the world, that copper deposit has a unique fingerprint. The impurities of the ore in that particular location is unique to that location. No two copper mines have the same fingerprint. So the Michigan copper contained an impurity of 0.05% nickel. But in the North Africa, they could not find any mines and any reason for there to be 0.05% nickel in the copper. So when we started doing some testing on it, we discovered that this Egyptian copper that's in the tombs came from Michigan. Now, that's something that isn't in the history books right now, but it's a smoking gun proof because of the DNA of the copper itself. The impurities in the copper make it very easy to identify. So there's so many things like this, and so much traveling that took place before us. Now, if you have to move a large amount of copper, okay, from Michigan to the coast to get it aboard ships, what animal might you want to use for transportation other than the humans? Horse is a real possibility. So this is something that we need to look into and investigate further. So have I answered your question for right now?
You have, thank you. And with that, it's so interesting when you bring up DNA and so then taking it back to Rambo's DNA and learning so much more that we didn't realize before. And we'll even learn more now that we have Edelon to go to as a DNA place to send our horse samples to. But I want to talk a little bit more then about Rambo's DNA. So we've already talked about him being a Galisano and a Guarano, but we also found that he had cream draft in him. And that was a conundrum because a cream draft is an Iowan bred horse, and that was in the 1900s. And so then I turned to Sarah Annan to try to help me understand that more.
Which I took personally, because as I said, I got my Hickory colt, I think a year ago just about. And the Hickory herd is actually one of the herds that the Spanish Mustang registry got some of their founding stock from. And in the 50s, there was no talk of them being American cream draft horses. And I used to work as an assistant with a vet, and we would go to various clients, and he had several that had draft horses, Clydesdales, Belgians. And mostly the reason that we went to see them was because these horses were so footsore in this climate. They have a wide, broad, shallow hoof, and they have it's a very resilient hoof horn in a humid climate. When it gets dry, it crumbles. It has no ability to survive in this kind of arid climate. And so these horses would be so footsore they couldn't even walk out to eat irrigated pasture in the river bottoms. So there's no way that they're going to become a viable breeding population out on the mesas. So I'm going, this doesn't make any sense. I don't know where you guys are coming up with this. And then I have been working with the Mexican Criollo Registry, and they were trying to get some of their DNA results back from Texas A&M. And all of a sudden we have American cream draft horses popping up on the west coast of the state of Jalisco along in central Mexico, which is really remote, really rough, really difficult terrain, and you know, the horses that are there are little tiny beasties that can survive on bamboo and corn stalks. They're not 1,500-pound draft horses. And so, and I'm going, well, you know, I need to know how American cream draft horses got to Jalisco, and if you can't document to me and show me the trail, because they had to be taken across the border and shipped to Mexico, and somebody had to pay for all this, then there's another source for this, there's another explanation for why these genes are showing up. So I went and read up on the Iowa cream draft horse. It turns out when Anglo settlers got to Iowa, which was in the mid-1800s, there were already plenty of Spanish mares. The place was full of colonial Spanish or indigenous mares. But what the settlers wanted was plow horses. So they got horses, mostly Belgian, which trace back to northern Italy, if you look at all the old world stuff, and they crossed them on the Spanish mares. So you ended up with a very interesting and distinctive genetic profile. It's different from other draft horses. Then during World War I, a gazillion horses, literally 1.5 million horses were requisitioned. Mustang caught, free roaming horses were caught, farm horses were caught, and they were shipped to Europe for use in logistics and support in World War I. After World War I, there was this wave of domesticating the West, where the Taylor Grazing Act had people put up barbed wire fences, which we're finally trying to start taking down, and states began to enforce this ruling that the only stallions that could be bred were registered, and the only real registry that existed at that time was the thoroughbred. So these people who wanted to breed their American cream draft horses didn't have a registry, so they had to hide their stallions, and yesterday I was saying, along with their moonshine stills, get it away from the tax man. They didn't have a population of horses that could be recognized and shipped from Iowa to Mexico, which is kind of a long ways. So the American cream draft finally became a registry post-World War II. And post-World War II, there would have been documentation. Registered horses, you have to go through your health checks, they have to get across the border, they have to get taken there. Okay, so I'm trying to get this across to Texas A&M, to the genetic researchers, and I finally get really testy. And I'm like, look guys, if you're throwing up results that make no sense, you discredit yourselves. You discredit the whole field. And if you're going to persist, you know, in interpreting your results on the basis of your 8th grade politically correct history text, you know, it backfires on you. This doesn't make any sense. You're going to have to look further back. So when we began to look further back, what it turns out is that there are several populations related to the Hickoria herd that have the same kind of cross for different historical reasons. The American cream draft is these northern Italian alpine horses crossed on basically Central Asian mares. You find the same genetic profile in of all places, Poland. But you have to go back and look at the history. In Poland, you have, during the Crusades, during the medieval times, you had a whole lot of you know, sort of King Arthur type knights, Holy Grail, riding for Christ, riding stallions. They really didn't do a lot of horse breeding in Poland. Shortly after this, the Mongol hordes come, and the Mongols were doing this pincher effect where they planned to come in through Poland and down into Europe, and then they were going down into Spain, through France and Spain. And they would have succeeded, except that Genghis Khan died and all his sons had to go home. But the Mongol hordes rode lactating mares because you didn't have to have a support train. You didn't have to have logistics. You took a nap, your horse grazed, you got up, you drank some milk, you were good to go. So the Polish horses were northern alpine horses crossed on these Mongol Central Asian mares. And that's the same cross that we have in the Hickoria. So you have the Central Asian, these very early horses, along with the Golosinos, because there was also, I was telling people yesterday, this is not a highway. It's not a super highway. It's a fabric, it's a tapestry. So I'm not sure how many of you are aware that the Catholic Church finally, after 500 years, rescinded the doctrine of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery was posted, it was a papal bull that was posted the one that we're aware of in 1493, saying basically if you weren't baptized Spanish Catholic, you should be enslaved and dispossessed in perpetuity. Now and that was their excuse for dispossessing everybody in the New World, and also in Persia and in India, everywhere that they were going. So the first rendition of this came out actually in 1452, and it was aimed at the light horse cavalry of the Islamic Empire because they were the biggest threat to the Spanish Catholic aristocracy. And they targeted these people. They said it was Saracens, Moors, Jews, pagans, and it specifically said they were not allowed to go into those caves that were painted with horses and do those rituals. So you have 40 years of people who are primed to leave. They're not going to go back to the Islamic Empire because the reason they're in Spain is because horse people are disruptive when you get a settled, urbanized, agricultural empire. But as soon as there's an opening, they're going to jump on the boats, get their horses, and come across. And we have very little documentation of the first 15 years of horses that left Spain, because it was a very chaotic time. The Spanish aristocracy was not really settled till about 1507. What we do know is that Christopher Columbus actually went back to Spain to complain to Queen Isabella that the horses that he had ordered, that he had requisitioned, were not the ones that arrived. It was not the people that he wanted, and it was not the horses that he wanted. When he gets back to the Caribbean islands, all of those people and all of those horses are gone. They went to the mainland because they want to vanish from the Spanish Inquisition. So again, we have this cross of the old horses from the old world history, and then specifically in the Jiccarilla, as I'm looking at how do you get this bloodline in Jalisco? How do you get it in Baja California? Because I also got a message from a guy saying, I have a horse that I rescued out of Baja California, got her up into the United States, and it turns out she's a Noriker, which is a horse from northern Italy. Well, it turns out Charles III, who was the King of Spain in the 1740s, was the first Spanish aristocrat to actually grow up in northern Italy and then take the throne. And when he went to take the throne, he brought all of his friends and all of his horses from northern Italy to Spain, and when he mounted California mission expeditions, he mounted them on his northern Italian horses, which in history are known as the Neapolitans. So that's like the hardcore historical part. The fun part comes now. And I was telling Carla again this morning on the way down. We get to 1840. And this story gives you a hint of how mobile the indigenous people and the horses in west of the Mississippi really were. So there's a huge Shoshone guy who must have been really charismatic and a great organizer named Wakara. And he gets some French trappers. I talked with one of their descendants. It's Robideau is his name. There was at least one Anglo trader named Pegleg Smith. He also got more Utes, some Navajos, some Apaches, and whoever else he could pick up. I'm sure there were some local Hispanics that got in on that. And he says, look guys, I know how to do this. We can head to California and we can take all of the breeding stock between Los Angeles and San Luis Obispo. So they head out, they do this huge raid, they get about 5,000 head. And the Indians managed to get in and get out without causing any ruckus. Pegleg Smith is a loudmouth, drunken redneck, basically. Sorry guys, but and he wants to make a statement. He picks a fight. Well, the Spanish get all riled up, realize their horses are leaving. He's the last to join this group of 5,000 horses. And he's like, oh my God, the Spanish on our trail, it's terrible. So Wakara says, not a problem. I'm going to send half of you guys driving these horses north and west, split them up. So some of them went as far north as eastern Washington and Oregon, up there where the Tiger herds are. Some of them disappeared into Arizona, some of them made it all the way to the Four Corners area. And we know this because Pegleg Smith told this story to Kit Carson when he sold him the horses. And Wakara knows the Mojave Desert. He knows where the watering hole is. He knows there's actually only one. So he gets his horses and his people rested up, fully watered, And he has a little box canyon where he goes to hide out, and they erase all their tracks. All the Spanish can see is where the horses went through. So the Spanish get there, you have to water your horses when there's water in the desert. So they stop, they let the horses drink, loosen up the cinch, they get a bite to eat. About the time that they're totally chilled out, boom, here comes Wakara with all of his guys. They spook the horses, and they head north and west with another 500 horses with saddles, bridles, and weapons, and the Spanish have to walk home. That's how this American cream giraffe genetic profile got from northern Italy to the Four Corners area. So, and this is where, we're talking about the treasure in your backyard. I look at my little northern Italian horse and go, good Lord, guy, you carry a huge flag of history on your back. And the horse that could do that and still survive and still be just as ornery and pestiferous and full of personality as can possibly be. No, they're really, really special animals.
Outstanding. That's an outstanding explanation for the cream giraffe. And so am I correct in understanding then that the Hickoria horses, the cousins of Rambo, are the Belgian draft in that alpine area of Italy, and the Lusitanos and the Noricas and the Garanos and the Galasenos?
One of the interesting things that I saw in Gus Rothman's 2013 genetic study, he said, the Hickoria horses have a very distinctive genetic profile, but they have more heterozygosity than we would expect in an isolated population. And I'm going, that's because the Apache were horse raiders and traders for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they got Galasenos, they got Garanos. The Galasenos came very early, more of the Garanos came with the Basques, which was in like 1600, and then again in the early 1700s. We have the California mission horses. So it's like, yes, he is connected to all of those horses and all of those threads of histories. And most of those strains, you can't separate them from the people who bred them. So most of those horses, when you look at those genetics, if you look through New Mexico, you're going to find families whose history goes back and is rooted in the same areas as you find the genetics of the horse. And that's the other huge asset to these horses, is that they give us a window into the unwritten history. Because, as people like to say now, history is written by the victors. Well, not if you look at the DNA. If you look at the DNA, you find out what happened behind the woodpile. You find out the secret story. You find out what really went on. And for me, it's a really, really wonderfully cosmopolitan way of saying, we're all related. We have all been interacting peaceably, or not quite so peaceably, for thousands of years. And that reality is alive and kicking on our New Mexico hills. And it is such a treasure. We have to keep them present and healthy. And I had one guy tell me, he's a Hispanic guy, and he said, I know these are war horses because I was driving home up by Vallecitos. He said, and I was on one of those little roads through the mountains. He said, and there were two stallions. And they came out and they stood in the road. And one of them reared up and actually struck the hood of the car. And then they took off. And so the guy started driving. And they paced his truck at about 40 miles an hour down these little mountain roads. He was driving as fast as he could until they got to a place where I guess the horses felt they had chased the intruder off their territory. And they switched their tails and went back off into the hills. So, yeah, they can disrupt our urbanized, civilized lives. But they're so worthwhile. Because the stories behind that, and the stories behind the personality, and their willingness to engage with people in a way that, deer and cattle and almost no other animal does. There's no other animal out there that has as much wildness as the horse that is willing to actually engage in personal relationships with people. It's an extraordinary thing.
Do you have anything to add to that?
That's pretty good. One of the things I love about history is some of these real stories that you don't really see in the history books. And can you imagine what it would be like to be traveling across the desert in California and make it into Nevada and get stranded on foot. I mean, those Spanish suffered trying to get back to the coast. So these are very interesting stories. And another part about the Indians could steal the horses without anybody knowing, you know, as opposed to Pele, who made a racket, so caused his own trouble. And that does sound sometimes very American on this. We have one more marker on your horse. You want to talk about that?
Well, the other marker we have on Rambo is that he's a Welsh pony. The significance of that would be, and then I would like to talk a little bit about domestication before we close.
So I also have a stallion from Utah, who came back with a Welsh pony marker. And Welsh ponies, again, it's like, okay, show me when a viable breeding population of Welsh ponies was taken and dumped in the Southwest, in the Four Corners area. I don't know of it. What I do know is that during World War I, there were Mustangers, and we actually know their names. Monty Holbrook was a Mustanger who caught horses to sell to the United States Remount Cavalry for them to ship their horses overseas. So when you see interesting, like Cleveland Bay, Welsh Pony, Holsteiner, Hanoverian, Self-Francaise, what you're actually, show up on your Mustang, what you're actually seeing is the influence that our free-roaming horses had on the horses of Europe, of Western Europe. Because during World War I, 8 to 9 million horses were killed. That was the end of the horse as the queen of the battlefield. Horses fighting against people on foot win. No, hands down, it's not a problem. But when you came up with barbed wire, with tanks, with automated weapons, the horses went down like, you know, it was horrifying. It was a slaughterhouse. It was beyond belief the kind of tragedy that it was. And so there are Mustangers from the Four Corners area. And you know some of their names. There are stories about them. There are people that are still there. They were catching these horses and they were shipping them across the seas. And so, again, it's really important to understand the historical context of this genetic markers before you dismiss them all as being, oh, you know, they were just escapees from the latest 4-H project. And one of the things I like to emphasize on this before I hand the microphone away is most people ride geldings. Most workhorses were geldings. I looked a little bit into the research, and the area where the Percheron was bred in France, Perche is what it's called, they shipped 20 to 40,000 workhorses a year to the United States during the 1800s. All of those horses were geldings because you don't send your breeding stock to your competition. You know, and there is a strain of horses, it's the Theodore Roosevelt, the Nakota horses, that do have some Percheron in them. But what ended up happening was there was a French aristocrat who had enough money to buy a bunch of horses from the U.S. Cavalry. There were Indian ponies from the Little Bighorn battle, I think. And he knew somebody, and he spoke French, so he could persuade the Perche breeders to sell them 6 Percheron stallions and 30 Percheron mares. So we have documentation of that. But that's the exception. Getting breeding stock out of traditional horse breeders is a major political and social coup. It doesn't just happen. And you can turn 500,000 geldings loose, and it's not going to change your genetic profile at all, because they have no testicles, they make no sperm, they make no babies. And you know, I have to get kind of crude and realistic about it, because people make sweeping statements without looking at the reality of it. And so, as I said, when you're looking at these interesting, especially when they're the small breeds in the British Isles and in Europe, what you're seeing is the influence of our horses as a result of the exchanges that were made during World War I.
Interesting. I was to ask you one more thing. So from an oral history from Carrizo Canyon, one of the oral histories is that the Morgan was the influence of some of the horses there. So can you explain that Morgan influence in a few words, and then we'll talk about domestication before we close?
So, well, there's two parts to this. One of which is that it was politically incorrect to say that you had a Spanish horse or an Indian horse. And that still holds true. I sent my little Woodcliff stallion back up to Utah about this, actually this spring. And when the livestock inspector came, he got out of his truck, just verbal diarrhea, saying he hated Indian ponies, and he hated Spanish ponies, and he hated it, he hated it, he hated it. And I took him in the barn, and I showed him the horse, and he stopped, and his jaw dropped, and he said, God, that's a gorgeous animal. I said, yeah, that's my Indian pony. And a lot of the hickoryas are these beautiful mahogany bays, like the Morgan. They're a very stocky horse, they have a very full neck, a very erect hip carriage, they're incredibly personable. So it makes a lot more sense to say, my bay horses are Morgans. Again, I don't know of a breeding population of Morgans that was brought to New Mexico before the Royal Farms was established in Espanola in the 60s and 70s. The other part of that is that there was a guy, and I cannot remember the guy's name, usually my brain is pretty good about this, but in the early days of the English colonists settling up in the Northeast, there was a guy who actually made friends with the Paiutes. And he had a standing contract with them for them to bring horses in off the plains for the northeastern colonists to buy, because the Northeast is it's mountainous forest country. It's not really big grasslands. It's a very different, forest ponies live there, but they tend to be small, and it's a different type of animal from what we think of as a riding horse. So the Morgan was bred out of some of these plains mares, which are the same ones that were taken down into the hickoryia. So again, there's a connection, but it's distant and it's difficult, and you have to read through the cultural prejudices to see what really happened.
Okay, I have one last question, and maybe a comment from both of you. But I want to, just talk about the concept of domestication versus feral horses for us. And we have about 2 minutes. And so if you can do that, and then we'll have a closing comment from you, Rusty, after she discusses a little bit about the difference between domestication and feral horses.
So the really important thing to understand is that up until the industrialization of farm equipment, it was not feasible to raise horses in confinement. Mares and foals were raised in the landscape. And actually there's a bunch of papers coming out that I know about, because in one of my horse training books, I said, the writings that we have from the 16th century talk to the aristocrats who walked to the menage and were handed a horse that was saddled and bridled and broke to train. We don't talk about what it took to get that horse there. When people start researching what it took to get that horse there, it turns out that up until 1900, basically, horses were actually bred in Central Asia, in the landscape. It was big herds of horses running loose. They were the ones that were going to be caught and broke to ride were separated, they were acclimated, and they were brought in on these huge horse trading markets. So when you have stories that go all the way back to Greece with Persepolis. Okay, so the Greeks were warriors, they wanted riding stallions. They weren't horse breeders. The horse breeding thing was really completely different. So there isn't any difference historically over the last 5,000 years between mares and foals running in the landscape, producing horses that can be rideable, and supposedly feral horses in North America running loose, getting caught by the BLM and being turned into riding horses. There isn't any difference. There are a couple of mutations that are specific to the modern domestic horse, but they're interesting. One has to do with reducing the sensitivity and reactivity of their back so they buck less, and one has to do with having them be less hypervigilant. But there's not a change. It's not like the difference between dogs and wolves, where dogs are cute and small and they have a smaller brain and bigger eyes. That kind of domesticity doesn't exist for the horse.
Thank you. And Steve, how about when the horse might have been first domesticated with a bit, so to speak?
They are teaching us now that the horse was domesticated in the steppes of Asia roughly 5,000–6,000 years ago. And with this, that's a fairly short time. We have some interesting evidence that indicates the horses may have been domesticated much earlier than that. One of the ones that we have been studying is the teeth of the human beings. Now have the ability to go in there and examine the type of calcium of the teeth and determine what animal it came from. And they're finding a lot of horse milk in people that are much older than supposedly domesticated horses. So this is an indication that the horses were domesticated at a much earlier date than we have thought. In Portugal, they have some caves with horse paintings in them. In these caves, we are seeing something that looks much like the modern day Andalusian horse, with that big curved neck that they're so famous for, painted in these caves. So with that, we have lots of fun things that is out there that maybe at another time we'll get to talk about that indicates horses were domesticated much earlier than we currently think.